In this next series of clips from The Birth of a Nation, we're going to explore how Griffith builds community as part of his sentimentalizing project with the KKK. This project of community building starts before Reconstruction in the South. In this first clip, we're going to see how even during the Civil War, Griffith works to build community, and what kind of community he is building. The community that he is building is not one merely composed of Southern planters, but instead includes all people of what he will later on identify in the movie as Aryan. Now, in this extended scene, Colonel Ben Cameron, who will be later on identified as the Little Colonel, is leading his troops at a battle in the Civil War, while his family is back home praying for him. Now, we're going to watch his regiment be successful in taking 2 lines of fortifications. However, they are doing so at great cost to their own ranks. Notice the brutality of the hand-to-hand combat that is taking place. This fits in line with the movie's other agenda, that is, its anti-war message. But for our purposes here, what we're going to see is Ben Cameron's nobility of character contrasted with the brutality of war. It will be Ben Cameron's nobility of character which is going to help foster this building of community, this bridging of the gap between Northern whites and Southern whites. Notice also that at no point is Ben Cameron's command ability questioned by the movie. He is fighting against impossible odds, thus staying in line with what I will later talk about, that is, the anti-tragic elements of sentimentality. In the midst of all the horror of war, Ben Cameron, the Little Colonel, is going to take time out from the fighting in order to bring water to a fallen Union soldier. This is a part of this community building. You might normally expect that as soldiers on opposite sides of a battlefield, that there would be no quarter given to the enemy. But instead here, not only works to comfort the individual soldier, but is cheered by both sides of the battlefield. His actions here bridge the gap of difference between the two communities, the Northern whites and the Southern whites. This is going to be pivotal later on in the movie. But of course, right now, nothing can overcome the horror of the war in which both sides are participating. Because of this brutality mixed with community building, we not only have a setup for community building is tied to sentimentality, but it also seems clear here to Griffith that conflict between groups of people who should be part of the same community is brutal, disgusting, and horrific. In contrasting the community building we saw earlier in this scene with the killing that is going on now, Griffith takes great pains to show us consequences for not being a part of the community he envisions, not unlike what Stowe does in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Notice that the commander of the Union forces begins to participate in this community as well by ordering his men to cease fire and by succoring the wounded and bleeding Colonel Cameron. Now, this next clip takes place after Reconstruction has already taken place. Ben Cameron's father, Dr. Cameron, has been rescued by members of the Klan from the clutches of black soldiers. In the course of their escape, they have come to a cabin occupied by 2 Union veterans. The seeds of community sown by Cameron earlier reach their fruition in this scene, and this scene is perhaps the most pivotal one in the entire movie in terms of building community. Now let's stop the film right here and take a look at this placard. Notice that the former enemies of the North and South are now united in defense of their common Aryan birthright. Rather than being a part of two different groups who other one another, Griffith wants to argue that whether you're in the North or in the South, whether you're agrarian or urban, is less important than one's common Aryan birthright. Imagine for a moment being an urban worker in the North in 1915 watching this movie. Instead of seeing a movie about a bunch of Southerners who you don't know anything about, Griffith makes it clear that you share something in common with the Southerners who have formed the KKK. Just as Stowe does in Uncle Tom's Cabin, so too Griffith here makes one want to be a part of the community in question, so as to help foster sympathy. By itself, this does not equate to sentimentality, but without arguing for this sense of community, neither Stowe nor Griffith could accomplish their sentimental purposes. Notice that the smaller scene in the cabin is running parallel to the larger conflict taking place in town. Both Stowe herself and Jane Tompkins, in her criticism regarding sentimentality in Stowe, talk about the need for individual conversion. In this movie, Griffith postulates that the actions of the individuals in the cabin are just as important as the large-scale battle taking place elsewhere. The individual conversion into community that took place with the two Union veterans is just as important as the larger conflict fighting for the rights of Southern whites that takes place throughout the rest of the movie. In fact, it's so important that the Klansmen are going to immediately depart and rescue the people at the cabin after having just rescued Elsie from the clutches of the evil Silas Lynch. We're going to pause the movie briefly here to point out that Elsie's father sitting next to her is, of course, Stoneman, the radical who advocated for Reconstruction earlier. Even he gets to participate in this community of whiteness, or this Aryan community, that Griffith advocates for. Now things are looking bad for the folks inside the cabin. Griffith is going to pile on the melodrama here, but we shouldn't see that as a strike against the movie because, of course, Gaskell uses a very similar setup in Mary Barton. Also point out that Mammy is also inside the cabin with the Union veterans and the escapees who are being refuged there. It's interesting that Griffith allows for a forming of community here and elsewhere in the movie between blacks who are properly in their place and their white masters. This is not unlike the kind of bond we see between Uncle Tom and St. Clair in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The difference here is, of course, that order has been overturned, and that Griffith is arguing for something very different than Stowe. Notice that as the black soldiers enter the first part of the cottage, they blithely kill the members of the cottage that they actually get their hands on, with no regard to anything. Sort of anti-community contrasts with the sense of community we see established earlier, further marking the black soldiers as other. Those interested in cinematic history should be aware that the cross-cutting between the Klansmen coming to the rescue and the actions inside the cabin is the first time this cinematic technique has ever been used. Griffith invented this exciting action movie technique for this movie. And as Roger Ebert points out in his blog posting on the movie, those who first saw this movie in 1915 would be very excited by what they're watching. And the Klansmen have come to the rescue of the occupants of the cabin. They are of course rescuing not only Ben Cameron's father, Dr. Cameron, but also the Union veterans and Mammy that are inside the cabin. This sort of completely fulfills the obligation of community, this community for which Griffith has been advocating for most of the movie.